those who are unaware, sword and sorcery is a subgenre of fantasy that follows sword-wielding heroes who often go on epic adventures and dabble in elements of magic and supernatural along the way. This genre has been a beloved staple in literature for years, but lately its success on the big screen has been a bit more of a hit-or-miss situation. Sometimes a few releases catch fire at the box office, but more often it's been overshadowed by the popularity of science fiction, even though the two genres share a lot in common. The 1980s were a golden era for sword and sorcery films, largely due to the success of films like Conan the Barbarian and the genre's influence on the original Star Wars trilogy. Plus, with shows like Game of Thrones, House of the Dragon, and The Lord of the Rings of Power gaining traction lately, it's clear that this genre is making a comeback to become more popular than ever. I think, despite its rich history, this genre often doesn't get the attention it deserves. While most sword and sorcery movies fall under the broader fantasy category, not all fantasy films fit into this subgenre, and because it's a niche within a niche, it can be very tricky to pin down. Given that the essential themes of the genre typically deal with valiant heroes, enigmatic wizards, damsels in distress, powerful creatures, romance, and often the struggle to save a kingdom, this genre is incredibly diverse, spanning across numerous films and subgenres, each offering its own unique take on fantastical worlds. One of the more popular franchises some of you might remember from the mid-80s is the Barbarian Queen franchise. Some might even say that in 1985, when the Barbarian Queen released, it left quite an impact on the exploitation tradition and became culturally significant within the context of entertainment in that decade. Even though Barbarian Queen didn't receive the same hype as Red Sonja or Conan the Barbarian, it did carve out its own niche within that ongoing cinematic trend. At a time when action films were predominantly male-dominated, Barbarian Queen stood out for featuring a strong independent female warrior as its protagonist. This helped pave the way for more female-led action and fantasy films, even though the character's portrayal was often undercut by the exploitation elements typical of the genre. Because the franchise mostly relied on sensationalism, including violence, nudity, and taboo topics, to attract audiences, it drove a lot of criticism regarding the representation of women. But now, Barbarian Queen can be celebrated as a bygone era of filmmaking, whose appeal lies in its unabashed embrace of genre tropes that once influenced pop culture. Still, the low-budget, campy aesthetic of such films has influenced a new generation to be interested in the concept of female warriors like Wonder Woman, Furiosa, Daenerys Targaryen, and other heroines in series like The Witcher. You can certainly trace part of their cinematic lineage to the trailblazing, albeit flawed portrayals in films like Barbarian Queen. So, without wasting another moment, let's explore this entire franchise in detail. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin.
Follow me.
Barbarian Queen, 1985. Hector Oliveira's 1985 film Barbarian Queen, starring the late Lana Clarkson, is kind of a wild ride through the sword and sorcery genre that simply leans heavily into its own cheesiness. While it might be considered ridiculous from almost every angle, that's what makes it such a guilty pleasure for fans of such low-budget, kitschy flicks. While mainstream audiences might dismiss it just as another B-grade sword and sorcery movie with a ton of violence and boob fondling, still there's a lot of fun to be had if you don't take the film too seriously. Barbarian Queen sort of flirts with the idea of being an unintentional comedy, but it becomes rather clear that the filmmakers were in on the joke. They never really intended for it to be taken too seriously. You'll find yourself bawling on the couch from the subpar acting skills, the not very effortless action sequences, the super tasteless violence, especially on the women, of course the over-sexualization of the important female characters. In my personal opinion, once you're hooked to the kitschy side of cinema, this franchise will certainly become something you can't resist. They're cheesy, they're amateurish, and they're a blast to watch. So, the particularly thin storyline of Barbarian Queen starts on a brisk note with a woman being brutally gang-raped by a band of evil men. We then see a peaceful barbarian village preparing to celebrate the wedding of Queen Amalthea to a dashing prince named Argan. Meanwhile, the forces of Lord Arrakir drag the woman naked through the forest after assaulting her, and then launch a brutal attack on the villagers. Even though Prince Argan and the rest of the warriors try to fight off the marauders, Arrakir's men overpower them. In the chaos, Queen Amalthea gets away safe by faking her death after fighting a bunch of Arrakir's hooligans. In the meantime, both Taramis and Prince Argan are taken captive with several other villagers. Her happy village was now in shreds, ridden with mercilessly slaughtered bodies of men and women who couldn't save themselves. The only survivors, other than Queen Amalthea, was her handmaiden Estrild and a warrior named Tiniara. Now fueled by a desire for vengeance and the determination to rescue their loved ones from the tyranny of Lord Arakor, the three women decide to go on a journey to Arakor City with the intention of saving the captives and avenging their fallen village. As they journey towards Arakor City, Amathea, Tiniara, and Estrild stumble upon a small encampment of Arakor soldiers. Meanwhile, we see a young woman chained naked to a pole while they're drinking inside the camp. She's beaten, bruised, and scarred in the most horrific manner. Soon, a disgusting soldier slowly approaches her, holds her scarred face, and orders her to smile. Just as he proceeds to force himself on her, Amathea rams her sword right through his neck. She then leads Tiniara and Estrild to launch a surprise attack on the rest of the soldiers. After killing the men, they find Tadamis being held inside one of the camps. But she's deeply traumatized after being abused and forced to witness such horrific scenes for a prolonged period of time. Tadamis, being seemingly lost in her own world, doesn't respond to anything that her sister or the other women have to say. Following this, all the girls take horses and other supplies from the encampment and start making their way to stop Arakor's tyranny. After reaching on the outskirts of his settlement, Amathea and her warriors come across a few members of an underground resistance. After a lot of discussion, while the resistance agrees to help smuggle the women into the city, they decline to join their fight against the tyrant Arakor. Once inside the city, Amathea discovers that Argon and the other men from her village are being forced to fight as gladiators in the town's central arena. Meanwhile, Taramis, who's still not been able to get over her trauma, spots Arakor leading a procession of troops into his palace and, in her confusion, approaches him. Recognizing her from the camp, Arakor allows Taramis to follow him inside. Elsewhere in the city, Estrild gets raped by two of Arakor's guards, but when Amathea and Tiniara rush to help her, they too are overpowered, and all three women are captured. After being taken inside the palace, Estrild is forced into becoming one of the harem girls who serve the gladiators, where she reunites with Argon and reveals their failed attempt to rescue them. On the other hand, Amathea and Tiniara are being interrogated separately in the most grotesque possible manner. Arakor personally commands their torture. At first, we see Tiniara being asked many questions by one of the guards, who also threatens to burn and rape her. She doesn't give up how and why she made her way into Arakor's settlement. But Tiniara, being the cunning warrior she is, manages to cut herself free and escape the guard by scaring him with the fire. Unfortunately, the guard at the gate of the room instantly stabs her, and she dies in the most uncomfortable possible manner. Meanwhile, Arakor is questioning Amathea and proceeds to humiliate the queen in the process by stripping her naked. When she fights back and refuses to give in, the tyrant hits Amathea and sends her to the dungeon to be tortured. Arakor then goes into his bedroom, where his men present a barely clothed Taramis to him. After teasing her a bit, the tyrant pulls the sheets off his bed and sends a butt-naked woman running out of the room, only to take Taramis as his new concubine. Later, he takes his concubine along with him to the dungeon, where Amathea has been stripped down to just a leather collar and thong and tortured on the rack by a creepy doctor. Now, I don't know about you guys, but this doctor was giving me major organic mechanic vibes from Furiosa, a Mad Max saga. Anyways, Taramis pretends not to recognize Amathea, while Arakor demands that Amathea reveal everything she knew about the rebels who helped her enter the city. Despite the excruciating pain, Amathea refuses to talk, so Arakor gives her until morning to cooperate before leaving. As the torture doctor continues to question and repeatedly torture our Barbarian Queen, Argon, along with the other gladiators and Estrild, secretly begin planning an uprising against Arakor and his evil horde. Later, at night, Amathea's creepy, puny-faced torturer tries to rape her while she's still strapped on to the rack. As he proceeds to violate her, interestingly enough, Amathea fights back by pretty much clenching the guy's penis with the strength of her vagina, and it drives the creep crazy in pain. When he begs her to let him go, Amathea demands him to release her from the rack. The creepy torturer complies, and our Barbarian Queen takes this opportunity to throw him into a pool of bubbling acid before making her escape from the dungeon. Along the way, she reunites with Estrild, who just killed a guard to escape the castle herself. Together, they run away from the castle and regroup with the rebels. With the rebels now on board, they join forces with Argon to plan the overthrow of Arakor during the upcoming gladiatorial games. Next day, Queen Amathea and the rebels come together to join the gladiators to launch an attack against the evil horde. In the midst of the battle, Amathea faces off against Arakor in one-on-one combat, only to be disarmed and nearly killed. Just as Arakor is about to strike the final blow, something strikes Taramis to intervene, who steps in to stab the tyrant in the back and kill him. The film ends with a despicable man's satisfying death. As Amathea and Argon are reunited once again, they celebrate the city's liberation from Arakor's evil regime. Honestly, much of the film is about a bunch of evil perverts who jump in at the chance of tearing off a woman's clothes and raping them. While you might think it's just another B-grade soft porn core rape fantasy film from the 80s, there's nothing inherently sexy about the scenes. Given that the film is a medieval rape and revenge story and a product of the trashy 1980s, it's really not surprising that it includes scenes of sexual violence. However, what is unsettling is that every major female character gets raped, creating a repetitive and uncomfortable layer of exploitation throughout the film. Even if they are kitschy, at one point the sight of topless, busty blonde women being raped and tortured will make you inherently uncomfortable. While a movie featuring women in Amazonian-style bikinis should be fun and sexy, the constant and gratuitous scenes of mindless sexual assault will overshadow any enjoyment, leaving you feeling grimy, despite the eventual victory of the female characters over their oppressors. Still, the fight sequences in Barbarian Queen are pretty decent, with a lot of hokey-pokey sword fights in between. Plus, it really does a good job at propagating the difference between a hot-headed male warrior opposed to a strategically strong female one.
My lords.
Barbarian Queen 2, The Empress Strikes Back, 1990. What you should really admire about the second installment in the Barbarian Queen franchise is the sheer balls of naming its subtitle while referencing to a cult classic Star Wars sequel. But after watching the film, I have to say, there's not much to admire about it, especially as a sequel. Despite its title, Barbarian Queen 2 barely qualifies as a follow-up to the 1985 Barbarian Queen. The only real connection between the two is that both star model-turned-B-movie queen Lana Clarkson. This time around, Clarkson plays Princess Athalia, who resists becoming a traditional lady, despite her old handmaiden's efforts to dress her in proper attire and groom her for a politically strategic marriage. In this film, we're basically dealing with the classic I don't want Disney princess trope, where a young woman simply can't wait to escape her old life in search of something more. However, unlike the stories of Ariel or Belle, this one comes with a lot more nudity. Athalia is a proud and beautiful princess in a troubled kingdom, but one day she receives news that her father, the good King Aiko, has gone missing in some mysterious battle and is presumed dead. After the supposed death of the former king, we meet the film's main villain, Ancaris. He is the treacherous brother of Aiko, wastes no time seizing the throne with the help of his sadistic second-in-command, Hothrax. Formerly the court's chief strategist and an obviously shady character, Ancaris demands that Athalia should reveal the secret of the scepter, the royal magic entrusted solely to her. But without any proof of her father's death, Athalia refuses to hand over the scepter, accusing Ancaris of plotting to loot the treasure and install his cronies in positions of power. Of course, her defiance lands her in the palace dungeon, thus making her question if the entire court is so corrupt that no one objected to the imprisonment of their princess. While she's rotting in the dungeons of the castle, Ancaris' daughter Tamis visits her with some food and then helps her escape the dungeon so Athalia can get to the room where the magic scepter is. But she's just as evil as her father, as Tamis tries to manipulate the princess to learn the magical words from her, so she could help her father seize the royal magic for himself. Now, the scepter is being kept in some kind of magical fire trap, and only Athalia and Aiko know the magic words that allow someone to safely handle the scepter and activate its power without being incinerated. As Athalia takes hold of the scepter, she's cautious about using its power, fearing that if she activates it and father is still alive, he'll lose its magical protection. But how did the king die if he was being magically protected? Guess we'll never know. Anyways, as Athalia says the spell to take the scepter off the fire, Ancaris, Hothrax, and a group of guards burst into the room. This is when she quickly tosses the scepter to Tamis, only to realize too late that it was a trap. Tamis had been pretending to help her all along under Ancaris' orders to uncover the secret of the scepter. It really doesn't come as a shock when she turns out to be an arrogant, bratty child who demands her father to keep Athalia as her new slave. When the bitchy child forces the princess to kiss her feet, Athalia pushes both of them to take the scepter away and manages to toss it back over the fire trap, keeping it out of her enemy's reach. Now enraged, Ancaris orders Athalia to be executed. As Athalia is taken to the town square for her execution, she makes an escape, although the word daring might be quite a stretch. If you watch the movie, you'll notice that the few guards on the wagon are not even paying attention to her. Conveniently for Athalia, the guards escorting her to the gallows seem to be both deaf and oblivious, allowing her the chance to easily slip out of her poorly tied ropes, take down the guards, and escape on horseback. The guards seem completely unbothered, almost as if they were on autopilot. One of them didn't even react when she jumped onto his horse, stabbed him, and tossed his body to the ground. Anyways, after Athalia flees into the wilderness while being on the run from Ancaris' men, she's rescued by a passing thief named Zala, who takes her to meet a group of forest-dwelling warriors. These rebels are people who have fled Ancaris' oppressive rule and are trying to survive in the forest. And since this is an 80s sword and sorcery flick, most of them are played by beautiful women dressed in revealing Amazon-like gear. Furthermore, this group of gorgeous women who are plotting to overthrow the corrupt kingdom are in need of a new leader. I wonder who that could be. To prove her worth, Athelia simply had to defeat their current leader in an impromptu mud wrestling match in a method that, to be honest, might not improve most political discussions. I mean, we literally see both women tear each other's top off and fight bare-chested in a one-on-one hand combat. Of course, Athelia wins, and soon enough, she, along with a buxom band of outlaws, taking on rapists and robbers as they work their way up to overthrow Ancaris. On the other hand, the new king betroths his daughter to a handsome boy named Orion, who apparently only has eyes for Athelia. How original. Now, Orion has to sit back in the castle and please the princess till the time comes when he marries her to become the new king. We then see Hofrax and a group of soldiers harassing a pair of peasants in the forest. Why? Simply because he's a powerful man who doesn't consider the peasants to be human. While the peasant girl tries to flee, she's quickly caught by 3 guards who, very predictably, tear off her top and prepare to assault her. Luckily for her, Athelia and her rebels emerge from the bushes and surround the guards. Even if Hofrax orders the rebels to drop their weapons and surrender, they refuse. What follows is another battle filled with poorly choreographed sword fights, rubber arrows, and badly timed punches. Just as things start heating up, the guards retreat to alert the castle. In a jarring jump cut, we're taken back to Rebel Village, where Athelia is doing her best to rally the villagers. With a lukewarm, inspirational speech, she manages to fire up their anger, and they place their allegiance to her as their new leader. What Athelia doesn't realize is that Hofrax is already planning a counterattack as he leads his soldiers back into the forest the next morning, determined to wipe out the rebels once and for all. On the other hand, while out hunting for food, Athelia and Zarla stumble across another fierce, leather-clad barbarian woman. This new stranger, as it turns out, is Mute, the victim of Hofrax's cruelty. She pulls down a black scarf to reveal a long scar across her throat. After bonding over their shared struggles, the trio quickly become friends, and the Mute woman, eager for some payback, joins the rebel cause. The next day, Hofrax, Orion, and their guards are herding a group of downtrodden peasants along a forest road. But Athelia and her band of rebels stop them. After Athelia and Hofrax share a few sharp insults, he charges Ada, only to be suddenly caught in a rope loop that yanks him off his horse and leaves him dangling from a tree. Unfortunately, the hanging rope is so loose that it eventually wriggles up and ends up draped limply around his shoulders and neck. The shoddiness of this scene is hard to overstate. And then, of course, we get another sword fight between the peasants and the royal guards. Anyway, Orion also gets knocked out and is taken captive instead of being killed because, you know, he is Athelia's old boyfriend. Oh, and Hofrax gets captured too. Why they didn't just kill him is beyond me. Back at the rebel village, there's a victory celebration that checks off nearly every medieval movie cliché you can think of. Meanwhile, in a corner, Hofrax is tied to a post, awaiting his fate. Athelia then walks over to him and asks why he's so afraid of women. He responds by describing how women are a waste of time. After setting the record straight with Hofrax, Athelia has a chat with her ex, Orion, who's now been freed from his bindings and is casually strolling around the camp in slacks and a button-down shirt. To cut to the chase, Orion tries to convince Athelia to return to the castle, while she tries to convince him that her cause is just. Then they exchange a steamy glance, which ends with Orion taking off Athelia's bikini top, and they have sex out in the woods. After their tender moment, 2 lovebirds return to the village square, where the villagers have decided to humiliate Hofrax by stripping him down to his underwear. Apparently, that's their way of getting back at him for years of brutal oppression, kidnapping, and murder. But Athelia stops them for some delusional reason. Finally, Orion and Hofrax are tied up again, placed on horses, and sent back to the castle as a warning to Ancaris to stop the oppression. Seriously, just kill Hofrax when you have the chance. This just give him a warning nonsense is frustrating. And to make matters worse, they didn't even blindfold Hofrax, so now he knows the exact location of their base camp. Yeah, smart move, rebels. Back at the castle, Hofrax is wrapped in a blanket and getting a well-deserved scolding from Ancaris for his blunders. During their conversation, Hofrax mentions that Orion seemed a bit too friendly with Athelia, the traitor, but Orion remains calm and defends himself by claiming that a prisoner must follow orders. Sensing Ancaris' doubts, Orion reassures him of his loyalty to the kingdom. To test this allegiance, Hofrax decides to reward him with the task of carrying out the first executions of a few peasants. So much for Athelia's plan to send a message to stop the oppression. But this is all part of a trap to lure Athelia into the castle and get the secret of the scepter out from her. As expected, the rebels, who seem to lack any real strategic sense, show up at the castle's town square just as the executions are about to begin. You'd think they'd try to hide their identities, especially since Hofrax had seen their faces while he was imprisoned at their camp. But no, they stroll into the square as if it's just another day. Unsurprisingly, Hofrax spots them immediately and signals his men to stay alert. Actually, it turns out only some of the rebels show up without disguises, because Athalia, Sarla, and the new mute barbarian woman are all dressed as nuns. When one of the guards reports to Orion that the sisters want to bless the prisoners, Orion quickly realizes that these nuns are actually Athalia and her crew in disguise. Since Orion is fundamentally a good guy, he lets them through the perimeter to get close to the prisoners. In a twist of absurdity, one of the guards asks the nuns to bless his sword. Athalia agrees, but insists she needs to hold it to perform the blessing. When the guard hands his sword over, Athalia promptly stabs him. Of course, chaos ensues as everyone in the town square suddenly brandishes swords and starts fighting the guards. The battle scene is a mess of poor continuity as guards appear and disappear, bodies randomly show up on the ground, and at one point, a guard just stands with his arms raised, seemingly inviting the rebels to stab him. Although the rebels flee the castle, Athalia ends up getting recaptured, seemingly on purpose. The next scene gives us a déjà vu of the first Barbarian Queen torture scene, as here too we see Hofrax strap Athalia to a rack and torture her in a dungeon. He then cranks the wheel, supposedly stretching her body and inflicting pain. True to form, Hofrax also rips off her top to provide more exposure for the audience. Despite the intense torture, Athalia stubbornly refuses to reveal the secret of the scepter. Hofrax, frustrated but not entirely ruthless, leaves her to her thoughts as he heads off to dinner, giving her a chance to consider her predicament. But somehow, Athalia manages to wriggle her hands free in no time and slips out of the dungeon. Very conveniently, the dungeon door is unguarded, a new leather bikini top securely fastened. Athalia stealthily navigates the castle's empty hallways towards the scepter chamber. Once there, Athalia hesitates to use the scepter's power because she's afraid that activating it might harm her father if he's still alive. But after a few agonizing moments of indecision, Hofrax bursts into the chamber and recaptures her, putting an end to her brief moment of hope. We again abruptly cut from the scepter chamber to see Athalia back on the rack, this time bare-breasted again. Moving on, Hofrax decides he's had enough and orders Orion to send a squad of soldiers to wipe out the rebel camp for good. Being the good guy that he is, Orion cleverly sends them to the wrong location. Meanwhile, back in the dungeon, Tamis the Brat places a poisonous spider on Athalia's arm. The situation becomes a bit murky here, but the spider supposedly bites her, giving her just a few days to live. Finally, we jump outside the castle to find the other rebel women, a few peasants hiding and plotting their next move to break into the castle and rescue Athalia. The rebel rescue squad then manages to sneak into the dungeons and free Athalia, Orion tagging along. Later, we see Tamis, heartbroken over Orion's defection, so performs a spell that transforms her into a grown woman. Now fueled by her desire for revenge, she heads to the rebels in her new form. Meanwhile, back at the camp, Athalia is recovering from the spider bite with the help of some good food, a bit of affection from Orion, and her old handmaiden. Orion also delivers the news that her father is alive on his way back to the castle, which gives Athalia a much-needed boost. Unfortunately, a group of the king's soldiers arrives at the camp with devastating news that Athalia's father is actually dead. Once the shock of this revelation wears off, there's a silver lining where Athalia has finally embraced her role as the new queen, is ready to lead the rebel forces into battle against Ancaris the next day. On the same night, Tamis, who's now magically grown up, sneaks into the camp and kills Athalia's old handmaiden. Despite being cured of the venom, Athalia is still in bed, feverish and delirious. In her state, inadvertently mutters the final spell of the secret of the scepter, which Tamis overhears. She then goes into Orion's camp to kill him. He recognizes Tamis just in time to stop her. Rather than executing her, Athalia decides to capture Tamis and dress her in the same rebel attire, forcing her to join the assault on the castle. On the day of the attack, the king's guards approach the castle while the rebels wait in the woods. After the guards present the king's body to Hofrax, he opens the gates to bring the body inside. But this turns out to be a ploy, and the rebels quickly storm the castle. In a quick cutaway, we see that Tamis has managed to slip past her rebel guards and sneaks into the castle's keep. With the secret of the scepter in her possession, this could spell some serious trouble for the rebels. Back in the castle, a massive sword fight breaks out between the king's guards and the rebels, but Athalia and Orion make their way to the scepter room with only minimal resistance. Curiously, most of the guards they encounter are wielding spears, which seem impractical for the narrow corridors they're fighting in. But with Hofrax in charge, it makes a certain kind of sense. The final duel, of course, takes place between Athalia and Hofrax, which ends in a dramatic showdown with Athalia defeating Hofrax and ending his reign of terror. Meanwhile, Tamis finally reaches the scepter room with the scepter. However, her father, Ancaris, mistakes her for a rebel due to her adult form. Before she can explain herself, Ancaris stabs her with his sword. According to magical rules, Tamis immediately reverts to her child form after dying, making Ancaris realize his grave mistake. Later, in the scepter room, Athalia finds that Ancaris has taken his own life in his grief, which means the scepter is now rightfully hers. With the powerful artifact finally in hand, it climbs a castle wall and addresses the triumphant rebel army with a stirring speech. She mentions that it's always been magic that's kept her rulers in power, rather than the goodwill of those they govern. After mentioning that the real magic lies in the trust and belief of the people who place their faith in their leader, Athalia declares that only faith will rule this kingdom. To conclude her powerful message, Athalia throws the scepter into the crowd, symbolizing the true power comes from the people and magical artifacts. The film ends on this note, suggesting that while power can be used for good, it's ultimately the people's belief and unity truly govern a kingdom. If the first film of the franchise was a mix between Xena, the warrior princess, and Conan the Barbarian, Barbarian Queen 2 is essentially a gender-swap take on the Robin Hood tale, with element taken from the magic in the Master of the Universe. I mean, the secret of the scepter was really not that far away from the power of Grayskull. It tries to be a classic story of rebellion and adventure, only with busty female lead and some gorgeous Amazonian rebels to add in the medieval flair. Barbarian Queen 3, Revenge of the She-King. So, Barbarian Queen 3, Revenge of the She-King was a planned continuation of the Barbarian Queen franchise. The project was announced in 1990. The production was supposed to continue in Bulgaria before it was abruptly cancelled. Apparently, even if the earlier films were low budget, the third installment reportedly suffered from much more severe financial issues, leading to many delays and an inability to complete key scenes. There were also many disagreements between the director, producers, and cast over the direction of the film. Although they started the shooting process, the franchise was known for its low-budget production, which often meant limited resources and tight shooting schedules. As the series progressed, keeping up with the cost had been increasingly difficult. Given that Lana Clarkson's career had taken a different turn at the time, there are rumors about her refusing to come back for another sequel. And without Lana and her topless scenes taking the lead of these films, there was really not much for the filmmakers to work on. Plus, by the early 90s, the popularity of sword and sorcery films had waned. Even if it was a B-grade film, investors were less interested in funding such projects, especially because the expected returns were not promising after the second installment of the film had tanked commercially. The lukewarm reception likely led producers to question the financial prospects of a third installment. Given the increasingly competitive nature of the film industry at the time, investing in another sequel may have seemed too risky. So, with the taste of the audiences shifting, the market for low-budget fantasy films shrinking, it significantly reduced the commercial viability of continuing the Barbarian Queen franchise. Barbarian Queen 3, Revenge of the She-King was supposed to follow a similar formula to its predecessors, focusing on a strong female warrior in a fantasy setting. The film was supposed to revolve around a once powerful queen who had been betrayed and dethroned by a rival king. The queen, now a fugitive, would gather a band of loyal followers, reclaim her throne, and exact revenge on those who wronged her. The storyline was expected to involve elements of magic, battles, and the exploration of themes like betrayal, loyalty, and the struggle for power. The titular She-King would have been portrayed as the typical busty but fierce and cunning leader, driven by a desire for vengeance and a strong sense of justice. The film would have likely included the same themes of intense combat scenes, subplots, and an underdog story reclaiming power. But I can't really confirm. It was supposed to be the plot line. It was never really confirmed by the production team. Wizards of the Lost Kingdom 2, 1989. Lana Clarkson returned to play the character Amethyr, PG-rated Wizards of the Lost Kingdom 2. Interestingly, the film reused battle scenes from the first Barbarian Queen film, but despite Clarkson reprising her role, there doesn't seem to be any real connection to the Barbarian Queen plot. To be honest, the Amethyr in Wizards of the Lost Kingdom 2 even feels like a different character compared to the one Clarkson portrayed in Barbarian Queen. This film was a sequel to the Argentine-American cult favorite, Wizards of the Lost Kingdom. In the film, the aging and bumbling wizard Caedmon is given the task by Grand Wizard Vanir to train a young farmhand Tyor, who's destined to become the Chosen One. Now, Tyor's mission is to free the three kingdoms from the grip of three evil sorcerers who each rule with the power of a magical object. To succeed, Tyor must complete a challenge in each kingdom. In the first kingdom, Baldur, his task is to free Princess Ermin to spark an uprising to overthrow evil sorcerer Loki. But Loki, who's holding three maidens as his hostage and wields the Amulet of Light as his source of power, attempts to defeat Caedmon and Tyor. However, Tyor manages to disarm Loki and turn him to stone by using the sorcerer's own weapon on him. In his second quest, Tyor teams up with Princess Amethyr, a powerful warrior who once ruled Vanir. With the help of his allies, Tyor tries to free the kingdom of Vanir from the grip of the second evil sorcerer named Donar. At the end of the quest, Tyor is sent by Vanir to face Donar alone, retrieve his source of power, the magical sword of justice. Inside Donar's castle, Tayo nearly falls under the spell of Freya, who's Donar's mistress, but he ultimately resists her feminine wiles and claims the sword. Meanwhile, at dawn, Amathea leads an assault on Donar's Colosseum, successfully liberating her kingdom from his clutches. However, Donar somehow manages to escape to Zord, the third kingdom ruled by the third sorcerer named Zaris. So, Tayo and his group set out on their journey to Zord, where they encountered the Dark One, a legendary warrior who agrees to help them liberate the kingdom. Even though the Dark One defeats the Protector, who's the monstrous guardian of Zars's castle, Tayo, Caedmon, and Idun, the Dark One's wife, are captured and taken prisoner. In retaliation, the Dark One takes the Sword of Justice and joins the townsfolk in their uprising, fighting alongside Irmin and Amathea. Meanwhile, Zars takes the amulet from Tayo and attempts to lure him to the dark side by using a magical chalice, apparently Tayo's final test. But our man Tayo can resist everything. Following this, when Caedmon tries to attack the two sorcerers, he's overpowered. Just as they're about to kill him, Tayo taps into his magic to ultimately kill Donar. Finally, Zars confronts Tayo, who's now armed with the Sword of Justice after the Dark One returns it to him. With magically enhanced strength, Tayo hurls the sword at Zars, fatally impaling him. After the battle, Grand Wizard Vanir appears to assign the Dark One with the task of choosing the new ruler of the United Kingdoms. So, he selects Irmin and Amathea as king and queen, before returning to his inn, and completed his part in the adventure. The film ends with Tayo being named the new Grand Wizard by Vanir, because he's now in possession of the sword, chalice, and amulet. As the new Grand Wizard, his new mission is to train Caedmon, continue honing his own skill, training travel. So, that was about everything I know about this franchise. Now, yeah, I get it, there's not much to talk about these films. There are no deeper meanings if we try too hard, and the female exploitation here is overtly sexualized with endless topless scenes that has no real meaning behind it and serving as a sick rape fantasy. Sure, the BDSM torture scene that ends in sexual assault try to signify the idea that a victim is now always weak, but still, it ain't much of a difference in an otherwise problematic concept the entire franchise. But still, these films have a certain takeaway, goofiness of its deranged villains. If you see these films, you'll notice how many other successful pieces that have been released later have derived their insane villains from the sort of characters we see in the Barbarian Queen franchise. With that being said, have you seen any of these films? What's your take on them? Let me know about your thoughts in the comments section below. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one, and be safe. Thanks everyone.